Okay, it looks like we're good to go. Okay, Rabbi say, ladies and gentlemen, welcome, welcome, and welcome, and welcome. This is wonderful to have everybody here. And before I begin, I just want to acknowledge our generous sponsor for tonight's class, the Solomon family, in honor of the neshama of Shalamis Chava, the daughter of Ayir Leib, Cheryl Goldlist. Is it Cheryl? I'll tell you in a second. Yes, Cheryl Goldlist. Her neshama should have an aliyah, and it's sponsored by her brother, Reb Jeffrey, and his wife, Eva Rosenthal. Her neshama should have an aliyah, and we should all be inspired by the Torah that we study together. So, let me begin with a little bit of a confession. I knew I'm going to have a crazy day today, so I'm learning this Gemara last night. I'm burning the midnight oil. I don't know what's going on over here. I don't understand this. What is the point? Just went over this again and again and again. And then, that's the point. That's the point. You know what I'm saying? You will know. So you're going to have the same thing. You'll learn this Gemara. It's like, hello, what? What is Mishna saying? And then you're going to see the whole thing is just going to come together. It's going to be fantastic. All right, so we're learning about this Omer offering. The Omer offering is brought from barley, fresh barley. And we talked about this a lot in the previous episode, the wind that shakes the barley. And tonight we're going to go against the grain. Was it you who asked me what do I have against the grain? It was you who asked, right? You'll find out. Why are we going against the grain? First of all, it's a good title, but we are going against the grain, and this is where greatness comes from. Greatness comes when you take the path of greatest resistance. You go against the grain of things, and that's when you're able to bring about a metamorphosis, really a flowering of life itself. Let us remember that the mitzvahs of the Torah are literal. There's things we have to perform and do, but they're also metaphorical, and they're also homiletic, and they're also ideological. They bring to us a whole range of things, and it's not disparate and not separated from one another. You cannot fully appreciate the message that's found in any part of Torah unless you learn it in its entirety. And I'm talking about even the technicality and the halacha, and because it's all part of it. It's all part of that bigger story. So we have to bring this firstling grain, the Torah says, as an offering, and it's the second day of Pesach. And on the night of Matzah Yom Tov, after the first night of Yom Tov, there's this big hoopla, and we go and we cut the firstling grain, and then it's brought to the Beis HaMikdash. It's brought into the actual courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, which, by the way, is super unusual. We don't bring like grain. You bring flour into the Beis HaMikdash. You don't bring grain. And not only is it strange because we're bringing grain, now we have to artificially cure the grain so that we can actually make flour out of it, because we need the flour like tomorrow, like today. We need to get this done. So there's a whole process of artificially aging or drying the grain so that we should be able to make flour. And that's what we're up to. That's what we're up to. And the last thing we did is, after singeing it and toasting it, then we left it out in the wind, so the wind would blow over it, and it would dry off the moisture. And we're in the middle of the Mishna. And then the Mishna comes along and says like this. After haruach min hasheves bay, after the wind is blowing over it. So we're on Menachos, on Tractate Menachot, and we're on Daf Samach Vav. The wind finishes blowing over. We're now ready to go ahead and produce the flour. So nosanuhu l'rechayim shel grusos. We place it into a rechayim. A rechayim is a grinding mechanism. a milling mechanism, but we don't put it into a regular rechaim. We put it into a rechaim of grusos. So first let me tell you what a rechaim is. Let me tell you what a rechaim is, what it was in those days. The rechaim in antiquity, and you can go to Israel today, they have places like Eretz Bereshit and other places where they will show you, like Pioneer Village here, they're showing you stuff that's like 180 years old. When in Israel, you're going to see things that are 2,500 years old. So there's a large stone. That stone is permanent. It doesn't move. It's very heavy, very large stone. You know, think of it as people have sometimes large safes in their businesses or large safes in the house. To move it in, you need a crane or some kind of machine. It's a big deal. And once it's there, you know, people can't just pick up and leave with this enormous safe. The millstone was very big. It was very big. And it needed like, I don't know how many donkeys and camels to deliver. It was like a big deal. Once you got that millstone in place, it wasn't moving anywhere. It wasn't going anywhere. And then there was another smaller stone which would ride on top of it. And you'd place the grain in between. The smaller stone was a little bit mobile. You could lift it up. And you place the grain in between. And then you'd have the stone, you kind of go round and round with the stone. And as the stone on top would go round, it would crush the kernels. And out of the kernels would come the dust, right? Which is the flour. The little particles, which is the flour. So this is the concept of what we call rechaim. Now, rechaims can exist in a very, very small way. And today people grind their own coffee. They used to have these little personal grinders. People make a little bit of flour. They'd have enormous commercial mills. Later on, much later on in history, they figured out that you can have a windmill, or you can have a mill that's by the water. I forget what that's called. The wheel that, you know, from the. So that's when they'd have these commercial mills, and people would bring in bales and bales and bales of wheat or barley, and you have the thing moving either by wind or by virtue of the force of the water that moved the wheel. In the times of the Talmud, we don't hear about windmills, and we don't hear about water mills, but we do hear about mills that were attached to animals. And the animals, a heavy ox, he would go in circles, go round and round and round and round and round, and that's how we would produce flour. That's how they produced flour once upon a time. Now, the Beis HaMikdash doesn't have any permanent millstones. We know exactly what was in the Beis HaMikdash. We know exactly how many offices there were, how many rooms. We know about the layout. There were no millstones. And, as a rule, and we're going to talk about this later on, there was no milling done in the Beis HaMikdash. You didn't bring things into the Beis HaMikdash unless they were finished and complete and what we call avoda ready. You brought avoda ready things in there. If things were not ready, you don't bring it in there. So you wouldn't bring in something which was already like fried or already baked or already scalded, which is the different ways they made the mincha or the menachot, the meal offerings, but you'd bring the flour there. You wouldn't bring the barley or the wheat. You'd bring the oil. You wouldn't bring the olives. There were olive presses, not in the Beis HaMikdash. We're all familiar with the story of Hanukkah, that in order to have oil, it would take them 8 days to produce the oil. Why was it take 8 days to produce the oil? So the simple answer, you got to crush the olives. And after you crush the olives, they had a very unique way of crushing the olives, a bit very, very pure. So the olives had to be treated in a unique way, in a special way. It had to like be in the sun, and then they have just a tiny little bit of juice coming out because they wanted it to be free of any sediment. Now, in today's day and age, we can accelerate this process with something called a centrifuge. Now, they do this in labs where they check people's plasma. They simply run it in a centrifuge, and then there's a separation. Then they can figure out, they can check the blood. The oil will separate. It will separate, but it takes a long time till it separates. Eventually, the oil will slowly, tiny little particles of oil, little droplets will gather, and eventually you'll have the oil on the top, and you'll have the sediment on the bottom. But that takes like a week. Today we can speed it up with the process of a centrifuge. Pop it in, pack the oil juice in, have it go spin around for, 5 minutes. You take it out, and you can actually see a vial. You can see the oil on top, and you can see it on the bottom. So in order to make the oil, they went to a place called Tokea. We know where Tokea is. There are Jews living there today. The world calls it Samaria or something, or West Bank. We call it Eretz Yisrael. And in Tokea, they had the finest olive oils that were growing in these craggy areas, these craggy mountains that were perfectly suited for growing olives. And it took time to produce the olive oil. They didn't bring olives into the Beis HaMikdash. There were no olives in the Beis HaMikdash. There was olive oil in the Beis HaMikdash. Now, what did they produce in the Beis HaMikdash? To the best of my knowledge, broadly speaking, the only thing they produced in the Beis HaMikdash with itself was the ketoret. The ketoret was the incense. So the incense was harvested, and of course there are 11 different ingredients that we used, and they brought these ingredients in a perfected state, but then the blending of the ingredients, that was something that was done in the Beis HaMikdash. And we know there was a special lishka, a special room, and that's where the perfuming was done. Perfuming is a euphemism. Well, that's a word that was once used for the process of blending. So they blended it seamlessly together to the point that it was impossible to know one particle from another particle. It was like a memulach tar, so well mixed that it became a new substance onto itself. This is the big exception. This is the big exception where we're bringing barley into the Beis HaMikdash. Why are we bringing barley into the Beis HaMikdash? This is actually crazy. What are we doing? Why are we singeing barley in the Beis HaMikdash? This doesn't make any sense.
And how can you bring a millstone in?
And how can you bring a millstone in? This is like, I'm like tearing my hair out. They don't have any millstones in the Beis HaMikdash. What are you going to hook up the oxen and have them go in circles?
Okay, but there's smaller mills too.
There are smaller millstones, true. But the smaller millstones are first of all, they're still pretty heavy.
No. I'm saying that like different things get different mills or milled.
Correct. Things are milled differently. So the Mishnah here tells us that it was rechaim shel grusos. Now grusos in the art school, they translate it as beans or peas, some kind of legume. In the Steinsaltz tradition, they're calling it grits. I don't know what that is. To me, it's just a word. Grusos and grits are the same thing. I don't know what either one is. Peas, I know what that is. It was some kind of legumes. So let's take a look at Rashi. What is this? A millstone which is made of grusos. A millstone made for beans. So Rashi says, shel grusos, shelo tochanot dak. They were not able to produce fine flour. We're talking about a lightweight kind of mill, not a heavy mill. Because the heavy mill is going to basically pulverize everything. So we're using a lightweight mill, and it's breaking the beans. Okay, you're grinding beans, but you're not grinding wheat. You're not grinding barley. You're grinding beans. And it's a thick milling. And why are we doing that? And so he says, Shekain derech hasolet, because that's the way of the flour. What does that mean? What is the way of the flour? Rashi says further, grusot, hainu loshon grisin. It means peas. It's peas. You're pounding peas. You're grinding peas. Shetochanem behem Poland. These grusot, you grind the peas. You're making hummus here. Ve'ein motzia ella haklipa b'nafa. We are not removing the hull or the husk, save in the sieve that came later. Mehagarinim ba'atzmam, that were going to be separated from the kernels themselves. So we're not separating the husk or the hull. That's going to be separated later on.
So we're just crushing these.
We're crushing these things. We're not grinding these things, we're crushing these things. So we're applying a minimum amount of pressure. We're crushing the barley, we're not grinding the barley. Well, if we're crushing the barley and we're not binding the barley, then how in heaven are we supposed to make flour? So he says, that would be a problem. Im yitchanu yofe, if we would grind it very finely, ya'avar kol haklipa, so then the whole hull or husk would come off, im hasola, together with the flour. Once we would put it into the sieve, then everything would, so to speak, come together.
Does this come after what we talked about last week?
Yeah.
Winnowing.
This is after the winnowing, and this is after getting rid of the stalk, and after beating it, after all that stuff. Yeah. And why are we doing this? Val Shem Kach Nikreit, this is why it's called Geresh Carmel. Geresh Carmel is the Torah's description, which means a coarse grinding. A coarse grinding. Okay, so what is going on over here? Let me tell you what this is about. And it took me time just to figure this out, because it doesn't make any sense. It didn't make any sense to me. when we're talking about fresh barley, it's very, very hard to separate the hull or the husk from the actual barley particles, like barley kernels, the kernels. Very hard. So what happens is that if we're going to grind it with a heavy grinder, invariably the husks are going to become ground up as well. So we're going to have ground up flour, but in the ground up flour, what else is going to be there? Bran. This is what we call in our vernacular whole wheat bread or whole barley flour, because you're putting the bran in. And by the way, that's good for digestion, supposedly. It's supposed to be good for your whole wheat bread. I don't know if that's true, but that's what they're selling you, a bill of goods. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, I don't know. But it's supposed to be good for you to eat some bran too. Okay, it's supposed to be good for your digestion. But it's not fine flour. So when you have like a coarser wheat, which is made of all other things, not just the actual flour, not just the fine flour, but it has other additives like a little bit of hull or a little bit of husk, what happens is that the flour behaves differently. It's like it's heavier flour. It doesn't rise in the same way. It's a different product. It's a different product. In the Beis HaMikdash, we're supposed to bring the finest of the fine. So we have this concept, halacha l'Moshe Misinai, that for the lechem hapanim, they used to put the flour through 11 sieves. 11 sieves. They would sieve the flour. So the sieve is like I guess like some kind of receptacle. It's got little holes. In today's day and age, we would call it like a screen. Okay? And you're sieving. You're like going like this. And what's happening is that the larger particles that can't fit through little holes are staying behind, and the very, very fine particles are coming through. And then it went to the next level sieve. So in order to make the lechem hapanim was made of the finest flour. 11 times it went through the process of refinement.
Just 13 times.
1 second, I said lechem hapanim. Lechem hapanim. Other menachot, halacha l'Moshe Misinai, have to be sieved not 11 times, but 12 times. And when it comes to the Korban Omer, it has to go through not 11, not 12, 13 times. You have to refine it 13 times. But if we're going to grind the barley that first time around, if we're going to grind it with a heavy weight of a big millstone, what's going to happen is that a little bit of the particles, the fine particles, are not going to be wheat particles, but they're going to be hull or husk particles. So no matter how many times you're going to put it through the nafa, no matter how many times you put it through the sieve, it's not going to be fine flour, because along with the fine white flour or fine white barley flour, there's going to be a little bit of darker husk particle. So therefore, what we need to do is we need to grind it so that the hull is separated, but we don't want to grind it so that the hull actually gets ground as well. So it's a coarse grind. Now, flour doesn't have to be ground into particles. It's in the kernel. The kernel has. If you would open the kernel, what comes out? Flour powder. That's what comes out. You don't have to grind the flour up. The flour is already, so to speak, ground. What we need to do is we need to put it through a sifter. We need to sift the flour to separate the coarser flour from the finer flour. So only the finest particles are going to be used. And in order to do this, we need to make sure that the first time we ground it, instead of grinding the flour or grinding the hull so that it would mix with the flour, that all we were doing was separating the husk, not grinding the husk.
The sieves, the sieves you're putting it through, the successively smaller holes, is that the way it works?
It was 13 different, it would certainly seem that way.
So you would wean out the husk like that?
Yes. No, but here's the thing. If you grind it, if you grind everything together the first time around, some of the husk will be ground so fine that it will always remain mixed in, because it'll be the same size as the actual particles of the flour. Let's remember, you don't have to grind flour to make flour. What you need to, for flour, what you need to do is simply to sieve it or release it. It's already in a powder form. That's what flour is. Flour is in a powder form. Of course, it has to be dried. Our biggest issue is not dry. It has to be dried out. It has to be cured. But once it's dried and cured, it's already going to be powder. So what we're worried about here is taking some of that husk and grinding it into powder. If the husk becomes powder, then we can never get the finest flour.
So why doesn't the sieving come before the grinding?
Why doesn't the sieving come before the grinding? Very simple. Because before the grinding, what you have is kernels. You can put kernels on top of a sieve, nothing's coming through. Because all the flour is trapped inside the kernel. So what I really need to do is crack open the kernel. That's what I really need to do. But I don't want to grind the kernel, because if I grind the kernel, then the kernel is not only cracked open. If I grind the kernel, then what happens is that the kernel itself, or worse, the husk itself, becomes powdered, and then it mixes into the particles. No matter how many times I sieve it, it's never going to be pure. So this is a very unique kind of thing. By the way, I want you to know that there is only one other korban, mincha, that we use the barley for, and that's a minchat sota. That's for a situation of suspected adultery, and that's not a positive thing. And we don't use fine flour for that. We specifically use coarse flour. And we don't put any oil in, because oil is a source of light and illumination. And fine flour represents refinement. And this is the opposite of refinement. And we'll come back to that in Eretz Hashem. So we have to bring this flour. We have to bring these husks. We have to bring these stalks. Bring everything, the whole thing. We have to go through this whole artificial process in the Beis Hamikdash. It's happening in the Beis Hamikdash. We have to grind it in the Beis Hamikdash. It means they have to carry in some kind of mill, some kind of bean mill. And you take the bean mill, and what we're doing is we're basically crushing the kernels, but not grinding the kernels. Crushing the kernels, not grinding the kernels. If you crush the kernels, it releases its flour. If you grind the kernels, then the kernels become flour or become powder, and that's what we don't want. And how do we know this? Because the Torah gives us milling instructions. The Torah says that when you're going to finish drying out that barley, make sure that it is geres carmel, that it is a coarse kind of milling. It's a coarse milling, not a fine milling. Let's go back to the Mishna now. So now we understand at least what's going on here a little, why we're using an unusual kind of rechaim. I still don't know why we're doing this in the Beis Hamikdash, but that's what we're doing. And the Mishnah says, "V'hoitzioi mimeno," you have to extract from it, isorin. You have to extract an isorin. So an isorin is a measure. It's a measure. And it's the word isorin means a tenth. It literally means a tenth. And the concept of an isorin, of getting out a certain amount of measure, means that when you're going to put it through the sifter, sieve after sieve after sieve, and sift and sift and sift, obviously more and more and more of it is left behind, and less of it is coming through. So you do a lot of sifting, a lot of sieving, until you're finally going to be able to extract an isorin, which is a tenth of a much larger measure, called a saw. So you have to have a tenth of a measure of the saw, which is called an isorin. And only after you have all that, so which is menufa, which went through a sieving process of shloishes reinafa, of 13 different sieves. We hear Rashi tells us, mefarish be'elu menachas, this is talked about later in 10 pages in Daf Ayin Vav, bedaka, begasa, bedaka, with a coarser sieve, a more refined sieve. It's a whole process of how they do the sieving. It's not like a straightforward thing, but it's a back and forth until we sieve it to create the finest of flours. Now, what is naturally going to happen if you take barleys, you take the barley and you dry it out, and you have the wind blow it over, and then you're going to grind it, or more like crush the kernels, and after you crush the kernels, then you toast it, and now it's dried, and you crush the kernels, and then you're going to be throwing it through these sieves, and you end up with a tenth of a saw, which is an omer, by the way. That's what an omer is. It's not a lot. It's a very, very small amount. What are you also going to end up with now? Think about it. A whole lot of scrap. Yeah. But by the way, the scrap is not, forgive me, crap. The scrap is good stuff. It's just not the finest of flour. But it's totally edible. Sure. Yeah, I mean, in the health food store, that's what they're going to sell you. It's not bad flour. In fact, as I understand it, they will tell you that the fine flour is not even good for you. They'll tell you this is the better. This is the brand. This is good for you. So there's a lot of available flour now that we just put a whole lot of work into creating. Okay, what do we do with this now? So the Mishnah says that after we finish going through this whole thing, we get the sarin out of it, there's leftover flour. And we can't use the leftover flour in the Beis HaMikdash. Why?
Well, because the Beis HaMikdash is the best stuff.
Because the Beis HaMikdash is the best stuff, but the most importantly, here, we're only allowed to use the finest of the finest of the fine, and it can't have any other Beis HaMikdash use now after this.
Right.
So and we don't bring anything else from barley. It's all wheat. So what are we going to do with this? So the Mishnah says a very interesting thing. V'hashar nifda. The rest has to be redeemed. What does this mean? So the concept of pidyon kodshim goes like this. If you have something which is sacred and holy for use in the Beis HaMikdash, it cannot be used for our own personal thing. That would be like an act of what you would call in English sacrilege. So if you take a telephone book, do they still make those?
No.
Okay. Remember, most of you remember we used to have telephone books, right? You take the telephone book, and I remember doing this actually, that you, like the high chair is like too low or something. So I remember, I have this memory of my brother sitting on a telephone book. It's a perfect fit. It fit right into the high chair, right? You put the kid on a telephone book and like lifts him up.
Old Jews in Florida drive with on them.
There you go. Okay, I didn't know that. Really?
Oh, yeah.
It's like a booster seat.
That's right.
Okay. Now, is that what telephone books were made for? For anybody who's under the age of like 25. They used to be these big fat books, okay, yellow pages. Now, not made to sit on, no. They're made to look up numbers. I know it sounds so funny to people, just look on your phone. But you used to have to look up in a book. And, and you found a number, so it's not what it's made for. Is it a sin to use a telephone book as something to sit on?
No.
No, who cares? So it's not made for that. So it's not. Would you do it with a chumash, though?
No.
No. Why? It's because it's a sacred book.
Right.
It's sacred. To use a chumash to sit on or prop a door open, we would call in English sacrilege. When something's dedicated for use in the Beit HaMikdash, it's dedicated for Hashem's use. It means it's taken out of circulation. That's why we use the term hegdish. Hegdish means something that has been made kadosh.
Well, wait. The dross is not being used by God in the basement.
1 second. Very good point. The dross or leftover is not being used by God, but here's the problem. It's right now owned by the Beit HaMikdash treasury.
It has to be redeemed, that's all.
So when we have something which is owned by the Beit HaMikdash treasury, we are able, sometimes, not always, we're able to redeem it. And what happens is the holiness of the Kedusha goes from the item onto the money, and then the money is used to purchase an item which is not kadosh, which is not sacred, which is not set aside, and you take that item and you use the new item in the Beis HaMikdash. This is not only in the Beis HaMikdash, we do this in our own lives when we, as farmers in Israel, have an obligation to bring a tenth of the harvest after we've taken the heave offering, the truma, and after we've given 10% of the leftover to the Levi. We did this on the first and second year of the agricultural cycle, as well as on the fourth and fifth year of the agricultural cycle. We separated a third tenth, and this is called Meiser Sheni, the second tithe. And what happened with it? It has to be eaten by regular Jewish people, not Kohen and not in Yerushalayim, in the holy city of Jerusalem. And there's an actual scrimmage of what the holy city of Yerushalayim is. There's even a rule of how you make the city of Yerushalayim bigger, to expand the scrimmage of the holy city. But it has to be eaten there by people who are in a state of ritual purity, who are not mourning, who didn't just lose a loved one, not ba'oni, not when you're in a state of aninut. Now the problem is, here's a Jew who lives in Afula, or a Jew who's living in what the world today calls southern Lebanon, which was biblical Israel, or he's living in a part of Israel, which today they call Jordan, or today they call Syria. And by the time he's going to go to the Beis HaMikdash, what he has may well end up turning rancid. So what do you do? It's going to go rancid. What do you do? The answer is you can take the food and you can take the holiness and you can apply it to silver. Specifically silver, by the way, because silver is a commodity that's easy to barter with. Gold, nobody can go walk into a store and buy fruits with gold. Gold is for people who want to store their money or to have treasures, they have gold treasures. But if you want a commodity, if you want money which is easy to spend, which is negotiable currency was always silver. And as I once heard from you actually, that silver is the index of silver has maintained its value for thousands of years.
Same as gold.
So, but what I heard from you is, as a commodities trader or as a currency trader, right? I once heard from you that the same amount of silver it cost to buy a chariot in ancient Rome is the same amount of silver it would cost today to buy a minivan.
That's right.
More or less. But it's not the same, but gold goes up and down.
In a suit too.
But gold goes up and down.
No, gold's about the same too.
Yeah? But wasn't platinum more valuable and then now gold's more valuable?
I remember you thinking that platinum was more valuable and gold had eclipsed it. It's still gold's much more.
So, but gold fluctuates, I think, much more than silver, if I'm not mistaken. Gold market fluctuates more. Huh? No?
Okay, I mean, what do you call it? The point of that argument is that gold and silver hold their value like over the millennium.
Yes, over the millennium. But what happens is that when there's like a rush on the market, all of a sudden gold goes up because people want to put their investments into gold. That's more secure. They know it's going to come back.
They call silver poor man's gold.
So, but anyway, the point of silver is it's negotiable.
Yes.
So if I come with silver to Yerushalayim, I can spend the silver. I come with gold, I don't know. I can't buy fruits and vegetables. So the holiness goes from the food onto the silver, from the silver back onto the food. We can do this. We have the ability sometimes to take holiness and move it from one thing to the next. From one commodity like food to move it onto a commodity like silver, which doesn't go rancid, and then to spend it on another commodity, and that's called pidyon. That's called pidyon. Now there are rules for this. It's not, you can't always be poda. You can't always redeem something. But sometimes you can redeem something. Sometimes you can. So when something is not going to be used in the Beit HaMikdash, we are allowed to recoup those funds. But the only way for us to recoup those funds is to sell it for mundane use. And then the holiness goes from the item onto the money. And then the money belongs to the treasury of the Beit HaMikdash. And when the treasury of the Beit HaMikdash spends it on another item, it becomes hegdish, holy. It's actually that simple. It's actually that simple. So the Mishnah says, what am I going to do with the rest leftover flour? And he says, very simple. Leftover flour, nifteh, will be redeemed. V'ne'echal l'chol adam, and then it can be eaten by anybody. There was probably like a very popular kind of barley to buy. Imagine that. Forget it. Forget Ezekiel's bread. This is like temple barley. There must have been a rush on the stores when they came out and said, who wants temple barley? Wow. Barley that came from the Beis HaMikdash. This is like so holy. Well, not really. It's not holy anymore because if it was holy, I know, but it came from the Beis HaMikdash. I'm sure it sold very well. And regular people could use it. So now that provokes the next question. If it is redeemed, which means it's gone from Beis HaMikdash treasury to the regular person's treasury, now we have an issue, a question about tithes. We have an issue or question about something called Kallah. So let me explain to you how tithes works. The land of Israel is holy. Because the land of Israel is holy, whatever grows in the land of Israel is holy. And if it's holy, well, it can't just be enjoyed in a casual fashion. So what we need to do is, as the Khatam Sofer explains at length, that we need to take this harvest, which has holiness wafting through it, and we need to take that holiness and concentrate it onto one small part of the harvest. We take, for example, 2% of the harvest, we designate or set it aside from the rest of the harvest, and it becomes food which is called truma. Truma comes from the word of larum, or huram, which means heave or lifted. Once it becomes lifted, who eats it? The answer is only Kohanim and their families. But they have to be in a state of ritual purity. And if they're not in a state of ritual purity, they're not allowed to eat truma. Now, truma, there was a market for truma, by the way. Kohen didn't only receive gifts, they could go to truma stores to buy truma. Why would a Kohen want to go to buy truma instead of regular flour? The answer is that supply and demand would dictate that it would be cheaper, because not that many people wanted to buy the truma. Very, very slender or select amount of people could buy it to begin with. And even they could only eat it when they're in a state of ritual purity. And ritual impurity was a part of life. So, for example, if you go to the old city of Jerusalem today, which is really the new city of Jerusalem, because the old city is the Silwan. That was the Thornhill of Jerusalem, which they built up today. The Tyropian Valley was filled up with landfill, and they connected the mountain next to the original city of Yerushalayim, and they made it part of Yerushalayim. This is end of the First Temple era. So they found a number of mansions, and they're convinced that Kohanim used to live there. Why are they convinced? Because they found like 4 mikvahs there. Who needs 4 mikvahs? The answer is people who use the mikveh very often. So this is clearly a palatial dwelling, very wealthy Kohanim. Huh? And the wealthy Kohanim, just like you have a washroom, they had a mikveh. Why? It's dinner time. Okay, let me run to the mikveh. Everybody runs to the mikveh. And then they have dinner. And you know what else they found there? A lot of stoneware. Stoneware is very expensive, and it's hard to make because they chisel out these stone bowls. So if there's a lot of stoneware, what does it tell you? It tells you that these people were very careful with ritual purity. Why? Because stoneware cannot become defiled. Something made of stone cannot become tameh. One of the things they found, incidentally, in the area where the proverbial Dead Sea Scrolls come from, is a whole lot of stoneware. And I was once reading a book of some of these ridiculous, conjecturing by academics of why the stoneware was there. I'm like, you silly people. They were just obsessed with ritual purity and impurity. It's not like all kinds of crazy ideas of what they were doing with the stoneware. It's very simple. If you know the background, it makes sense. It makes sense, that's it. So the Kohanim are going to eat the Truma. And the Kohanim, as a representative of the Jewish people, and they have a special neshama, they're in a state of Kedusha. They're in a state of holiness. In a state of holiness, they can eat the Truma. What about the rest of the harvest? The rest of the harvest has to be then another separation. 10% goes to the Levi. The Levi takes 10% of his 10%, gives it to the Kohen, and then the Levi gets to enjoy the rest. Is the rest holy? No, it isn't holy. It's more of a financial thing. It's our way of supporting the Levi, so the Levi is able to do his job and provide the spiritual leadership, and we are giving him, in turn, what the Levi needs to be able to feed his family. Okay, very nice. And then there's the Ma'aser Sheni we talked about. All right. This is all if the field is owned by a regular person. What if it's a field that's owned by the Beit HaMikdash to begin with? If it's owned by a Kohen, you also have to take Truma. You could just keep the Truma for yourself, but you still have to take Truma. What if it's owned by the Beit HaMikdash? Interesting question. What if the field is owned by the Beit HaMikdash? Do you have to make this separation? The answer is no. Why? Because the Beit HaMikdash is not a person to have a mitzvah. I'll tell you something which might sound fantastical and unbelievable to you. If we, regular Jewish people, Kohanim, Leviim, or Yisraelim, own chametz, we have in our possession leaven, chas v'shalom, over Pesach, we are going to be committing a sin. Bal yirah bal yamatzah, you're not allowed to have in your possession. And by rabbinic decree, after Pesach, you're also not allowed to consume it. But what if it's owned by the Beit HaMikdash? Is that a problem? Like, who would get the sin? God? Who is the Beit HaMikdash? The Beit HaMikdash is not a person. The Beit HaMikdash is God's treasury. It's owned by God, so to speak. So can you have chametz, which is owned by the Beit HaMikdash, on Pesach? Incredibly enough, the answer is yes. Yes. Why? Because that's not a jurisdiction of a Jew who has a mitzvah. So if it's owned by the Beis HaMikdash, so if the field is owned by the Beis HaMikdash, and the Beis HaMikdash did own fields, if the field is owned by the Beis HaMikdash, whatever grows there is, first of all, holy. Second of all, it doesn't have to be tithed. You don't have to tithe something because there's no person that has a mitzvah.
Could it be used for the korban, though?
Can it be used for, why not? Why not? My things have to be tithed. Your things have to be tithed. Beis HaMikdash things don't have to be tithed. Now comes the question like this. What happens if Beit HaMikdash goes and purchases grain in the rough? They don't own the field. They purchase grain. Does Truma or Meiser have to be taken from it? And here's where it gets really interesting. Imagine this. You're in the land of Israel, even today's day and age. You're in the land of Israel, and you come across a tree, a fig tree, a date tree, I don't know. Can you just like pick a date, assuming that it belongs to you or the person doesn't mind if you take it? Can you just pick a fruit and eat it? Can you just pick a fruit and eat it?
You can, but you're not supposed to.
So the answer actually is you may. Why? Oh, obviously a bracha. You may, and I'll tell you why you may. You may eat it because the only time that it becomes formally obligated in Truma and Meiser is in the post-production era. It has to be post-production. This is called, in language of the Mishna, miruach hakri. Miruach hakri means, literally, the smoothing of the pile. So if you're working in a field in Israel, can you eat as you work? Can you chew on some granola as you work? The answer is yes. What about the Truma and Meiser? It's not obligated in Truma and Meiser. When does it become obligated in the tithes? After the harvest is prepared. And what did they used to do? They used to take the harvest and make a big pile, and then they'd smooth down the pile. And when they'd smooth down the pile, they had a special tool, and they'd smooth it down. There were little jagged edges that they would cut off. And when that was a smooth bale, a smooth pile, from that point onward, you're obligated to give the tithe. Not before. So if the Beis HaMikdash purchases stalks that are still in the rough, at what point would they become obligated in what we were going to call giving Truma and Meiser? The answer is when it's all prepared. When did they take the stalks into Beis HaMikdash possession? When did these stalks of barley become a Beis HaMikdash possession?
When they brought them in baskets.
You could argue when they brought them in baskets, or we'll soon argue from the moment they were purchased, even before they were cut. So at what point would they become obligated in Truma or Meiser? The answer is, it wouldn't. Because at the time when the harvest was complete, it wasn't owned by a regular Yisrael, it was owned by the temple. And the temple doesn't have a mitzvah like that. Now you're taking flour from the temple after it's already been produced, but it was brought into the time of chiyuv of Meiser, the obligation of Meiser, when it was owned by the temple. So the question is now, is anybody obligated to give Truma and Meiser from the flour that has been produced? And the answer, says the Mishnah, is no. V'chayev b'challah upater min ha-meiser. You're obligated to give challah. You're exempt from giving meiser. Now, what is challah? Challah is literally a mitzvah that applies at the moment where the pieces of the particles of flour become one by virtue of coming in contact with an alkaline-based substance. So that's how you make dough. Flour becomes dough when it meets water. When flour meets water, the particles suddenly change. And the chemical change in the particles makes the independent particles come together as a seamless consistency called dough. By the way, you know what else happens when flour and water meet? Besides the fact that they surrender their independence insofar as the particles are concerned, you know what else happens? It triggers a chemical process. The chemical process is called in Hebrew chimutz. We call it in English leavening or fermentation. That's where chametz comes from. But that takes a little bit of time. So it takes about 18 minutes. About 18 minutes after it triggers something, apparently there's a chemical in flour which is called AMI. Amy B or Amy C, LACI, Amy B C Lacey or Amy B Amy C Lacey. And when it comes in contact with something which is alkaline based, like water, it creates a process, it triggers a process which left unimpeded will become chametz. How can you make sure it never becomes chametz? Huh?
Don't add water.
If you don't have water, you're not going to have dough. If you have no dough, you're not going to have matzah.
Add heat.
So there's two ways. There's two things. Number one is that you apply extreme heat. And guess what happens when you apply extreme heat? You kill the chemicals, and they can never live again. They're dead. Which is how people take matzah and grind it up and make matzah meal or matzah flour because it can't rise anymore. It's dead. Dead flour can't rise. The active agent is killed. You know another way that it can be killed or impeded? Extreme cold. But here's the thing. When you freeze it, once it thaws, it comes back to life. It comes back to life. So it doesn't really work, but it kind of does work. It would work for as long as it's frozen. So if somebody would take dough and flash freeze it, in theory, it wouldn't be chametz. They probably wouldn't do it, but in theory, it wouldn't be chametz. Many, many years ago, I went to take care of the Jewish inmates for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and so we brought them. We brought food for breakfast, whatever. And the prison warden said, "You can't bring any of that frozen stuff." I'm like, what are you talking about? She says, "You know that frozen Chalice stuff. Don't bring the frozen Chalice stuff." So we don't know what he's talking about, but this is long before today. It's a big business, right? They have Lenchner's has, a Montreal bakery has. It used to be something called Kineret Kallah. It was in a cardboard box, frozen, and I never saw this. My mother made challah, but you could use the Kineret dough, huh? It's like a weapon, anyway. So what used to happen is the Lubavitch organization would send challah for the inmates, and somehow one of the boxes was punctured, and they didn't know that there's an active agent, and they came back 3 days later, and the dough was like all over the place, and the warden had like a big issue with the dough and the cleaning and he's like, "No dough, don't bring any dough." I'm like, "Not bring any dough, okay, don't you? No dough." But the point is, when you freeze something, it kills the process temporarily. It freezes the process, which is why people have this crazy idea that if they freeze themselves, that they're going to be able to be brought back to life. I think Walt Disney froze himself or something. It's not happening. But it works for chemicals. It works for challah.
I heard there was one time from a mashgiach, one time with a non-kosher butcher place. They heard the inspectors are coming, and they handled like this meat left out of the fridge or whatever, unsafe level, unsafely, and you took everything you put in the freezer. The freezer got so cold, it kind of killed the bacteria, and when you tested the meat, you couldn't find anything wrong with meat.
Interesting. Yeah, okay. Anyway, like things that are extreme cold, it impedes certain chemical procedures. Okay. Going back to our Mishna now. So, how do you make matzah? The answer is you bake it fast. Because flour and water is going to result in chametz eventually. But the Torah tells us that the moment you mix flour and water, you have a mitzvah. And the mitzvah is to separate a piece of that dough and give it to the Kohen. Now when we make matzah, because we're so worried about getting the matzah baked on time, we don't separate it as dough. Instead what we do is, we first bake the matzah and then we separate the challah from the baked matzah. But that's only with matzah. With everything else, we take the challah when it is in a doughy state. Now, you might be familiar with this.
What do you do with that?
What do? We give it to the Kohen.
What do we do with that today?
So, in today's day and age, we operate under a rabbinic injunction that we should continue to take challah. This is a rabbinic idea because challah applies only in Eretz Yisrael, like all the tithes. So why are we taking challah in Toronto? The answer is because it's a rabbinic mitzvah. It's a rabbinic mitzvah that we should take some challah to remember the mitzvah. And what do we do with it? We burn it. We destroy it. We burn it. So you take a little piece of challah and you destroy it. In today's day and age, you take a little bit of matzah and they burn it. That's what the mitzvah of challah is. The question is, when does the obligation of challah begin? And the answer is the moment the flour hits the water and you start to knead it, the moment it becomes kneaded, the moment the particles surrender their independence and they move into a new reality called dough, from that moment you have an obligation to give challah. So in the Beis HaMikdash, the flour wasn't mixed with water. When you purchased the flour from the Beis HaMikdash, what did you purchase? A bag of flour. So when it was in the Beis HaMikdash's jurisdiction, there was no possibility to give challah. There was no obligation. The obligation didn't begin. When does the obligation begin? When you mix the flour with water. Who was the owner when you mixed the flour with water? You, the purchaser. Says the Mishna, chayav b'challah upoter min ha-meiser. You're exempt from meiser because when you took the meiser, then in that case, it was when it was obligated a meiser. At the moment the obligation of meiser was supposed to kick in, so to speak, was supposed to begin. It was owned by the Beis HaMikdash, so it can't become chayiv a meiser. But the fact that you are the one who mixed the flour with the water means that the obligation of challah would suddenly apply. Now, this is really fascinating. In the Beis HaMikdash, the opposite is true. As a rule, they didn't bring kernels into the Beis HaMikdash. They didn't bring husks into the Beis HaMikdash. They didn't bring the stalks into the Beis HaMikdash. What got brought into the Beis HaMikdash? Fine flour, only fine flour. So if it was only fine flour, what necessarily had to happen before they got the fine flour? It had to be harvested. It had to be milled. It had to be turned into flour. So for sure, all of the menachot, all the offerings in the Beis HaMikdash were flour from which tithes had been taken before it was flour. But in the Beis HaMikdash, that's where they mixed the flour and the water and the oil and turned it into dough. So they never gave challah in the Beis HaMikdash. The exact opposite. The meiser was given, never the challah. Here is the other way around. The meiser was never given, but the challah has to be given. That's what the Mishnah says. Rabbi Akiva, he says no. He's mechayev b'challah u b'meisers. What's Rabbi Akiva thinking? So Rashi says mefarash b'Gemara. We're going to get to that. The Gemara, we're going to talk about that. So there's a famous question which is asked about this Gemara. There's like something that doesn't make sense over here. And the question is, this is asked by the Mikdash David. He says, the Gemara tells us clearly later on that we only would bring flour into the Beis HaMikdash. Only flour was made hegdish. Flour. We didn't take stalks. We didn't take kernels. We took flour. So he asks, and he says, because it says in the pasuk, "V'lakachta solet." V'lakachta means you take. What do you take? Solet. V'afita ota, and you bake it. You take solet. So the Mikdash David says, I don't understand what's going on over here. What is the Mishnah telling me that it's not obligated in tithing? It wouldn't be hegdish at the time when it's stalks. It wouldn't be hegdish when it's kernels. It would only be hegdish when it's flour. So of course you're chayiv in meiser. This is the question that he asks, and he gives a very, very strange or convoluted kind of answer. So I found another answer. The Keren Orah has a totally different take on this. And I really like this. I love this. Keren Orah says like this. It is true. Ein meviin menachot min ha-tevel. You don't bring a mincha offering from tevel. Tevel, by the way, is the word that's used for harvest that the tithes have not yet been taken. So you can't bring a tithe if it hasn't yet been. You can't bring a mincha, a meal offering, if it hasn't yet been tithed. So the Keren Orah says, Hainu, that is to say, Shahaya b'reshut hedyot. It was in the domain of an ordinary person. And after it was in the domain of an ordinary person, v'chala lav isur. So then it was prohibited. What was the prohibition? Tevel prohibition. The tevel prohibition means that right now it's a mixture of truma and meiser and trumas meiser and ordinary things. So you can't eat it. Like let me put it to you this way. The Kohen eats his 2% in a state of ritual purity, and he makes a special bracha, asher kedishanu b'ketushato shel Aaron, and he's eating his truma. Can the Kohen eat tevel? Tevel is a harvest from which no tithes have been taken. Can a Kohen eat tevel? There's a binary answer. And it's either yes or no. can a Kohen eat tevel? The Kohen can eat truma. Truma is in a greater state of holiness. Tevel is when it's in a raw state.
Part of the tevel is
Part of the tevel is the truma. The whole problem with tevel is that there's truma mixed into the tevel, the offering. So can the Kohen eat the tevel? No. Because?
You have to separate it and define the percentage exactly.
That is absolutely correct. A Kohen is not allowed to eat tevel. In fact, if anybody eats tevel, including a Kohen, there's a very severe consequence. It's misa b'dei shemayim. It says you won't live out your years. Very severe consequence. So when the Kohen has truma, when it's a defined reality, that's another story. That's fine. But when it's yet an undefined reality before the tithes have been taken, the Kohen is not allowed to eat it. Nobody is allowed to eat it. It's called Isur Tevel. It's prohibited because it's called Tevel. So the Kerenera says that when it's in the Reshut Hedyot, Chal Alav Isur Tevel, it becomes prohibited because of Tevel B'yad Hedyot. So he says, because that's the case, that's have a question over here. How would you bring ordinary things into the Beis Hamikdash? The Kerenera says, but aval hacha lochal olav isur tevel. It never became tevel. Why did it never become tevel? How does it become tevel? When you're working on a field in Israel, you can chew in some granola. That's not a problem. Why? Because it's not yet finished production. It's before miruach, before the piles got smoothed down. When the piles get smoothed down, at that moment, it becomes tevel. As long as it's owned by a regular Jew in the land of Israel. However, he says here, there was nitmareach, literally, or proverbially speaking, smoothed, but it came biyad hegdish. And so the Kerenora says, because it became tevel, or became in its finished state, when it was in the domain of Hegdesh, lochi of Meiser, lochi of Kallah, there is no obligation whatsoever at this point. Why is there no obligation? Because in order for the obligation to set in, it has to be owned by a regular Jew. But this is owned by the temple domain. And the temple domain doesn't have ownership in that literal sense, in that typical sense or conventional sense. He says when it comes to Kallah, the Mishna says, that only comes later. Because the obligation of Kallah comes b'shas Gilgul. Gilgul is like a galgal, it's a wheel. But what happens is, the flour turns round. It's rounded into a dough. It becomes a ball of dough. But Le'inyan Meiser, he says, there's no such thing. So he says, so how does it work out what the Gemara says? The Gemara says, and he says, the Gemara says you have to bring it when it's already in a finished state, and you have to, how would it work out? So he says like this. Kol zman shehu mechubar, as long as the stalks are still connected to the ground, there is no shame tevel. There's no shame tevel. And he says here by the Omer, it was bought with money of Hegdish. When was it bought with the money of Hegdish? When it was still attached to the ground. Rabbi Issa Zalman Meltzer, in one of his shiurim, says a gewaldige concept. I mentioned this in previous episodes, I think even in the last episode. What happens if the first day of Pesach were to fall on Friday? So the first day of Pesach would end, and now it is Shabbos, because it was Thursday night, Friday. So now it's Friday night. Do you cut the Omer stalks on Shabbat? The answer is yes. How could you do that? Because it's a mitzvah in the Torah. You give a Brit Milah on the 8th day, that's when it has to get done. Says Zalman, so he says, think about it then. In that case, it had to have been Hegdish at the time already. Because you can't violate Shabbat to something which is not Hegdish. That means the cutting of the Omer is the mitzvah. It's a mitzvah from the cutting. The production is the mitzvah. This is a Beis Hamikdash activity. Turning it into flour is in the domain of the Beit HaMikdash. We have to turn the regular stalks, the kernels, into actual finest flour. It's all part of the Beis HaMikdash activity. It's radically different than every other korban mincha. Every korban mincha, bring me the flour. How fine it has to be, I don't care. That's your business. Do it off-site somewhere. The Beit HaMikdash will buy the finest flour. because that's what we use, finest flour. I'll also use the finest oil. When you make the finest oil, call me collect. We'll buy the finest oil. You make the finest onika, we're going to buy that onika. We're going to use that for the incense. Here, we're taking something which is in a raw state. And therefore, the Mikdash David's question doesn't begin. The Mikdash David's question was, it says, V'lakachta solet. Yes, it says, V'lakachta solet. That's with regard to all the other menachot. With regard to this mincha, the processing is part of the mitzvah. The processing is the mitzvah. And that's why Rashi says, because it says geres carmel, because it has to be coarsely ground. So some ask on Rashi, but there's the term coarsely ground applies also for something like the sota's offering. And over there it doesn't say keres carmel. And the answer is that the sota offering, you need a certain grade of barley flour. How that gets made into barley flour is not our business. We need a certain grade of barley flour. We take that barley flour, we consecrate it, it becomes holy, it gets used in the Beis HaMikdash. In other words, the upshot is that this korban mincha, this mitzvah, is radically different than all other grain-based offerings. It's radically different in that it's not a mitzvah that begins at offering stage or at kneading stage. It's a mitzvah that begins at harvesting stage. From the cutting, that's when the mitzvah begins. That's why it's done on Shabbat. And the Mishna tells us there would be a huge crowd of people. And because of the Sadducees and all this, the craziness, they would pick up and said, is this barley? Is this barley? He says, yeah, it's barley. 3 times. And then they say, Magelzeh, is this a sickle? Is this a sickle? 3 times. Yeah, it's a sickle. It's a sickle. Is today Shabbat? Today's Shabbat. Today's Shabbat 3 times. Why did they do all that? Because they wanted it to be very, very clear. It should be very clear to everybody we're doing something sacred now. So I'm thinking to myself, so what is going on here? Why indeed is it a mitzvah? How did the production become a mitzvah? Why should the production be a mitzvah? It's a meal offering. Bring the meal offering. Why is the production a mitzvah? And then it came to me. Then it just hit me like a ton of bricks. Chassidus asked the question, a famous question. And this is in many, many memorim of Chassidic discourses. Why is it that in Beit HaMikdash, where everything has to be brought in the finest and the best, that we're suddenly bringing barley? And within the barley itself, it's the finest and the best. Nothing needs more sifting than the Korban Omer. The lechem apanim is 11 times. The regular mincha is 12 times. Only the barley is 13 times. Only the barley. It's animal feed. And the Gemara calls it animal feed. So if it's animal feed, why do you have to have such refined flour? And why are we using animal feed in the Beis HaMikdash? When it comes to the sota, when it comes to the suspected adulteress, it says, he asa maisa behema. This was a person who followed his or her based instincts. These people who committed adultery were following the lowest instinct. They were acting like an animal. And an act of betrayal, it's not a decent thing. Besides that you're betraying Hashem, you're betraying your spouse. It's a betrayal of marriage. It's a treacherous way to behave. It destroys the trust that marriage is founded upon. So it's a non-menschlich thing to do. You say, oh, he's such a mensch, he commits adultery. No, nobody says that. That's the uber not mensch thing to do. It's that's like the super non-mensch thing to do. So in that case, because it was a non-mensch kind of thing to do, who does that? So that's why we bring fodder from an animal. We bring the barley. But this is the first korban of the year. We're starting off. What's going on over here? It's a korban omer. Whoopie-doo. So why do you have to bring it from? Why do we start off with animal feed? So you're going to say, well, the wheat isn't ripe until Shavuot. Good. So start on Shavuot. It's not like anybody can eat the food anyway now. The wheat isn't even ripe yet. Who eats barley anyway? It's not animals. So it's not even used anyway. So what do we need this korban for? What does the korban help us? What does it do for us? So Chassidus says that's because of the unique nature of this period between Pesach and Shavuot. We all know this is the time of Sefirat Ha'Omer. Sefirat Ha'Omer, this idea of counting up to Shavuot, there's one idea which is talked about the Rabbeinu Nissen, the Ran in the end of Pesachim. It's also mentioned in the Tshuvas HaRashba, that there's this concept of anticipation. Jewish people are anticipating the giving of the Torah. So then the question is, why did they start counting the second night? Why did they count the first night? And the Rebbe answered that question in a very easy way. He said the first day they didn't know when they're getting the Torah. They said, we're going out of Mitzrayim, we're getting the Torah. They figured the first day they leave Mitzrayim, we get the Torah. They said, Moshe Rabbeinu, it's almost Shkia. When are we getting the Torah? And Moshe said, oh, funny you should ask. It's going to be in a little while from now. It's been a little while. Okay, fine, so a little while from now. So how long? In 49 days. Started counting. Okay. So it represents the anticipation. But really, if you think about it, if you're counting up to something, you don't count how many days have passed, you count how many days are coming. Right. You say 49 days to go. And the next day you say 47 days to go. And the next day you say 46 days to go. It's only a week to go. It's 3 days to go. Instead, we're counting the days that passed. I spoke about this past Shabbat. So the idea really is not simply about anticipation, but the concept of Sefirat Ha'Omer is also a time of self-engineering and improvement. The Barley Tosfos famously teach that the reason why didn't God give the Torah right away? The Barley Tosfos say because the Jewish people were beaten and broken from slavery. They needed time to heal. And one could expand the words of the Tosfos also to mean trauma. They were traumatized people. They had to heal from the trauma, to be normal people, because if you come to a person who's in a state of trauma and you throw a Torah at him, he might just like, yeah, I'll take it, and then say, what did I just do? So we have to be balanced. Right? And the Or HaChaim talks about this in more detail. He said it wasn't just about a physical thing, it wasn't even just about physiological, it was spiritually. We have to be spiritual, we're at a very low ebb. And Hasidus talks about the idea that Sefira is connected to the word of Sefirut or Behirut, of luminescence, of light, to bring light into your life, to illuminate your life. That is to say that when we leave Mitzrayim and we start to prepare for Matan Torah, we should engineer our animal self. Every one of us has what the Alter Rebbe famously terms in Tanya is a nefesh bahamet, an animal soul. An animal soul. So what is the animal soul? The animal soul is not a bad thing. It's an animalistic drive. A person has something called the survival instinct. There's nothing wrong with the survival instinct. It's nature. True. There's a lot of things that are nature. The question is what you do with nature. And if a person allows nature to run amok, then he or she will do as they please, when they please, whenever it pleasures them. There'll be a bull in a china shop. A mensch is a person who is able to engineer or rein in those instincts so that he acts in a menschlich way, in a human way, in a decent way, by engineering himself and changing the behemoth. This is what this Korban Omer is supposed to be about. There's a beautiful expression from the Frierdiker Rebbe about the Nefesh HaBahamis. He said, why is it that God has to put us into this body? Why did he get stuck with this body? So he says, a Nefesh HaBahamis hu Baal Hanoah be'etzem mehuto. The Nefesh HaBahamis is a pleasure-seeking animal. That's what he is. What do people want? Pleasure. That's his nature. Teva Baal Hanoah, the chol davar v'davar, anything, gam davar katan, even something very small, hunana, he has a great deal of joy from it. And he gets excited about it, and he makes a big deal about it, and he tries to enjoy it. He's enjoying it. That's the nature. People like to enjoy things. They want to enjoy their food. They put more ketchup. I don't know. They want to enjoy everything. The nefesh, the teva of the nefesh Bahamis is a pleasure-seeking animal. It's not bad. The problem is, if a person is left to his or her own devices, where their pleasure becomes the only commodity that is relevant, then if nothing else matters, I can step over people, I can hurt people, I can do all kinds of terrible things. Why? Because I need my fix. Like the drug addict who's stealing from his parents and his best friends. Why? He needs his fix. And that becomes his fixation. All he needs is his fix. And he'll justify doing anything. So the criminal didn't start off bad. He became bad when he allowed that base instinct to control him to the point that he started to harm other people and do immoral things in order to get his desires fulfilled. The person who committed adultery probably didn't start off as a bad person. He was just looking for fun. And then he lost himself. So what are we supposed to do with this Nefesh HaBahamis? The answer is harness it. Improve it. Make yourself into a mensch. If a person has no ambition, he's never going to accomplish anything. If a person has no sense of self-value, he's never going to do anything. But if a person is only about self, they become a selfish creature. In other words, it's a process of refinement. By the way, where else do we see a process of refinement? Taking something which is in the rough and turning it into something which can be used. Where do we see a process of refinement? Well, gold and diamonds, but in food. The food is rough. We're going to winnow, and we're going to separate, and we're going to grind. And what happens? And here we're sifting and sifting and sifting. In other words, from things which are rough, animals can eat the grass. People want the bread and the cake. They want the pasta and the pretzels. So if you want to be able to refine that, the whole act of refinement, that is what the Korban Omer is about. That's it. That's what this period of the year is about. So I realized, this is what came to me. I realized that this whole story of the Korban Omer, that it's a mitzvah to take the stalks and to cut the stalks and then to dry the stalks and then to winnow the stalks and then to grind the stalks and then to sift the stalks. Why is it being done in the Beis HaMikdash? And the answer is because that's exactly what the Korban Ha'Omer is about. It's about refinement. The process is, that's what it's about, the process. It's not about the final product only. It's about the process of getting to the final product. It's not only receiving the Torah, it's the working on yourself during Sefirat Ha'Omer. And now it all makes sense. So you have to bring into the Beis HaMikdash stalks. And you have to take the stalks and you have to artificially cure it. You can't leave it to nature. It's like a person says, I'll become a mensch. Leave him to his own devices, he'll evolve into a mensch. I mean, certain things do happen. People do evolve into mensch. I remember one of my kids was still using like a pacifier, and they were like 5 years old, and my wife was going crazy. And the doctor said, you won't take him to a chuppah in a pacifier. He will get rid of it eventually. It's going to happen. But of course, parents get impatient. We want to get the kids out of diapers. We want to get the kids, out of their sussy. We want to turn them into a mensch. So the truth is, we're not supposed to leave nature to its own devices. We are supposed to accelerate the process. That's the story of the Korban Omer. And now it all makes sense. And this is the kasha of the Migdash David. The question doesn't apply here. Like the Keren Order explains. No, here it is from the cutting. Here it is from the winnowing. Here it is from the grinding and from the sifting. Where does that have to happen? In the Beis HaMikdash. Because that avodah, that refinement, is what the Korban Ha'Omer is really all about. And we take our animal fodder, and it has to be the highest level of refinement. 13 levels, like Bar Mitzvah. 13 levels, the highest level. Why? Because the message to us is you take the most base element, and you refine it, and you refine it, and you refine it, until you turn it into a korban, a mincha, a mechanism of holiness and closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That, my dear friends, concludes today's Mishnah. L'chaim, l'chaim, l'chaim. Thank you, everybody, for joining us in person. And thank you, everybody, for joining online. I look forward to seeing you back. And with Hashem's help, we will continue this series of Flower Power. Next week, we'll start to learn the Gemara. Yasher Koach and Laila Tov.